prior to break, there was a discussion going on about as we want to break up kubectl and make extensions on kubectl work well, we really needed a better solution than what we had for things like service catalog or CRDs. For kubectl to show something when you do kubectl get. There's a longer term direction for other types of commands. We had an open API based quick approach that went in alpha in 1.9 or went in alpha in 1.8. But ultimately, like the open API based approach was basically you specify a JSON path statement, and that's what shows up in a column. So it is a very limited thing, and it wouldn't work for anything more complicated or that needed to deal with lists. And so we had a approved proposal in SIG API machinery. Phil and I really wanted to hash out some of the details just to make sure we were on the same page. And we kind of argued through the cases of we want everybody using kubectl to continue to have a good experience for listing resources. It's kind of one of the most fundamental things you do in the kubectl. So if you have service catalog installed, you want to see a list of things in the service catalog. And there was feedback from the service catalog SIG that the open API column approach was okay, but not a great experience for some of the fields. And so Phil and I kind of got to a point where even though there are many different use cases for where you have a client that wants to be somewhat dumb about the types it talks to, and you need a little bit of smarts, we seemed like we were on the same page with regards to making sure that we want to continue to deliver a good experience for kubectl get, that because it is the primary touch point for a user to the platform, and as well as to the core resources. But we also want to, the open API approach works very well for CRDs, so you don't have to write code. And then in the future, for things like offline listing of files you have in the file system or showing summary data, we're going to need a slightly more client-centric approach for some of those use cases. But we were going to go ahead with server-side printing in 1.10 to beta. I was going to pull together the list of work items and do this on the mailing list, but I just wanted to say, like, several people have been involved in various parts of the discussions, and we think we got to a place where all the concerns could be articulated on both sides. So I was going to summarize and send that out probably tomorrow or Friday.
That makes sense to me.
Okay. That was all I had on that topic. If anybody has any comments, please respond when I send out the kind of the proposed work scope for 1.10.
Would you mind adding a link to the initial docs or the place where you were discussing with Philip in the agenda, or paste it in the chat so you can put in the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, this is scattered across 700 PRs. I'll link to the original proposal, though.
Cool, thanks.
I have a feeling that the next person to suggest what the... Oh, Phil, there you are.
Hey.
We just assigned you all the work.
Fantastic.
So I was going to ask, there weren't a lot of agenda topics. What do people want to talk about? Phil, did you have a concrete list of agenda items?
No, I didn't have anything. There's been, if there's nothing else, maybe talking about kubectl splits more might be something to talk about.
What about 1.10 planning? Is there a list of stuff in the 1.10 plan?
There's one that comes right away to my head. That's bumping the Cobra and P flag. there's an open PR, and I remember talking to Fabiano that there has been some work already happening, and there's one PR that just needs currently final review and approval. I've agreed with Joe that I'll do the review, and he will be the approver. So we're hoping to get that one in later today. Let me.
Okay,
The
great.
PR.
I should probably, Clayton, I'll publish a doc where we can put the formal place to do the 110 planning.
Okay.
Plugins is another thing I know that there is work being done on. And then I know Antoine is working on libraries for unstructured objects to make working with them a little easier.
That's actually good. I had started on that in the server-side Git stuff. Antoine, I'll ping you offline about what I have been looking at, and then maybe I can fold what I'm doing into yours.
Sure.
And then I guess unrelated, or not unrelated, but outside of kube control, but within SIG CLI, apply. We're coming. I think the tentative plan is to come up with another binary that just has the apply logic in it, not as a long-term plan, but just as a stopgap until we can figure out where to put that logic.
I mean, Phil, it's been a while since I've gone back to the draft apply proposal. I mean, I don't know that we have bandwidth to do much, but do we want to try and have a plan for apply by the time we ship 110?
Yeah, do you mean server side, or do you mean just
the server side one? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. At a minimum, I'll make sure this gets written up. When I talked with Jordan at KubeCon, we came up with a solution for at least the merge aspect.
Yeah, he mentioned that, yeah.
Which gets us probably 75% of the stuff that's in client side right now, the logic out of it, without introducing a complicated API or having to do too many changes. And so we may want to have a longer term plan that's going to go GA eventually with for the full apply thing and figuring out what to do with the annotation and how to deal with prune and more of the more nasty pieces. And then also maybe we can probably get the most critical pieces out of the client without doing that full route.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a long way of saying, yes, we should have something at the end of 110 that at least is a plan or direction.
And this was actually, someone brought this up, a porcelain mode for apply for people who did want to do a little bit more advanced scripting until there is an API. One way to try out the things we would do on the server would be a porcelain style apply on the CLI. And by porcelain, I mean a structured response that you could get JSON back instead of just an exit code, or do dry run. And we have some of the diff commands basically are variants of this. So just maybe that's something we just work into the proposal of how do we get some experience on the parts that are hard without necessarily having to put the API server in place.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of how we've been thinking about it. There's a number of pieces like the one you suggested. Do you want to list the items before executing with a prompt, so that if you're going to delete 10 items accidentally, you get a prompt and a list of what they are? Or do we want to change slightly the merge logic for the edge cases we see that are confusing to users and broken, and maybe change how those work? Or there's a list of porcelain pieces that would be good to try out in the client. I think a question we need to figure out, even just for the porcelain piece, is like, one thing we could do is just create a new binary and push it every 2 weeks, right? And then we don't have to wait till 110, but it can just have like all the stuff and apply as we iterate on it, and then fold that into either server side or client side, or figure out where it goes. Or we could put it in kube control where it would be available to a lot more users, but would be harder for us to push iterations on.
Yeah,
I think like we actually don't have to make that decision until closer to 110, because if we just develop the logic so that there's not dependencies on like core on Kubernetes repo, we can just like move the code, and that should take like not too long. So probably going to just like start developing that code immediately, so that it will be ready for 110 if we want it to be in kube control, but not make that decision up front.
right.
And yes, there's a design for that in the works as well. It's been discussed in various places, in various issues, the various things we want to do, but we need to pull all those issues and stuff together into a single place. Hey, Clayton, thanks for facilitating this meeting. I really appreciate it. I had kids wake up all last night and like slept right through my phone alarms.
If there's space in the meeting, I would like a moment to talk about generic endpoints, scale as an example.
Do you mean the sub resources? Is that what you're referring to? Like through sub resources?
Polymorphic sub-resources, yeah. It's something that's been explored server-side, and now we have pulls from a community member, Polynomial, who's been plumbing through the generic client through kube control. So you can generically scale things. It's really useful because it matches custom resource definitions, custom resources, which weren't matched before. I think that I'd like to see us expand those. And there are some obvious targets if we coordinate with API machinery. So we have scale, that one's happening now. But I also see things that we have in the CLI like logs and exec, where we have basically a command that is issued on a sub-resource where logically you have multiple resources that can participate in it, and would be good targets for making generic.
Yeah, I love that idea.
Okay, so I am going to take it forward probably to API machinery. That actually happens today, and decide what the next target is. Looking at it, I think that logs is probably the next easiest one. There's not a whole lot of existing pieces today. There's just pod logs, and it's streaming in one direction, not two, for us to just try to get that API working properly.
Log seems like a good target.
Okay.
It's probably worth, it's definitely worth converting the existing things that are imperative commands that could be just done generic sub-resources. I think that makes perfect sense. It probably also is, as part of that, is worth considering, like, are there things that we may want this to behave in a generic fashion? For instance, logs, I think, just works on pods now. And so like maybe how we'd envision that working for other things, like do we envision logs against a service or a deployment? Is the current request like going to work for those? And we don't need to solve those problems, but I think it's worth at least.
Well, I think we need to solve it for one. I was planning on taking forward a plan to use Discovery, choose a client-side match against a generic set of log options that can be used from a client. And we have examples today in Kube Control of logic to choose a pod out of a replication controller, as a for instance. I don't think services are there yet, but we have replication controller and replica set and deployment, as I recall, maybe a job too. Mache liked them. So
cool. Yeah. I think I just meant like when new folks implement logs.
Oh, yeah. Just being able to give it a structured object will really help.
Yeah. Yeah, and so along that same line, like I definitely like the area, and I think there's even a spectrum of solutions within there, and the ones I think I've seen with scale are cool. I think it's introducing them in the Go client, right, as a structured object, and then I forget the details, but effectively it's compiled into the Go client. That makes sense. There's like a prototype of something that's just exploratory that I published before the break, which allows the sub-resources and their request bodies to be dynamically discovered and not compiled in. And so there's a scale one, but in that case, the command doesn't even know about the scale sub-resource. So it dynamically discovers the sub-resources themselves and then looks at the request bodies for those sub-resources and then maps those into flags dynamically based on types and names and that sort of thing.
So if you aren't matching the sub-resource, you are just trying to match based on type. That sounds a little bit dangerous to me.
It could be loose. I mean, there's some aspect of this is there's the two parts. If I want to use this as a structured API, which I'm writing a generic client that is code-based, versus I'm writing a CLI, which there's already a translation layer between the strongly typed scale resource and the weakly typed CLI flags. So I think that's kind of there is a little bit of a distinction there, I think. Like the CLI flags are already another API that someone is layering on top. Just passing through whatever API you get, is the best we could probably do anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I think, within that, there's a spectrum from like, I know nothing about this API, so I'm just going to parse it based purely on type, to we've attached like metadata to the fields. So the scale resource, we could have like, for instance, the scale resource publish its request body and say this is these are the things and how to expose them, right? If there's enough data within the schema, either through convention or through annotating through configuration, you can skip the step of manually mapping flags to request body arguments. But you're absolutely right, David. Like, there's a lot of ways you can poke holes in that. I'm sure there's a lot of edge cases where you say it wouldn't work. So I think it's just worth something to explore, because what it does enable, if we were able to be successful in that, is it enables folks who write CRDs not to be restricted just saying I can implement logs or scale, but allows them to implement their own sub-resources that maybe only apply to their API.
Yeah, I like the good enough mentality for CRDs, which is you don't have to write a binary plugin and you get forced into the conventions. I mean, it's almost like Kube Control Create in some respects, which is arguably, if Kube Control Create deviates too much from the object itself, we're doing something wrong. Like, it's supposed to be just simple enough. But there'll be examples of, like, the field names of a Kube Control Create argument, if we ever revved any of the API versions, would start to drift And so now you run into this problem of, we have two APIs, the flags and the CLI, or the flags and the CLI and the API. And instead of being honest about making the user make that choice or having that convention, we're introducing a translation layer.
Yeah, kube control create. Is Ellen on by any chance? Or Antoine?
Ellen just was and then dropped.
Okay.
Slowly destroying your code.
Because yeah, she's been doing some work in that area. So I was curious if she had anything to pipe in about.
Well, what we're trying to do is, well, it's hard to explain. Like we get what resources are available and create the Cobra commands based on what's available. So you can create, you can go kube control, create, and the name of the resource, and the resources are what's available. And we were talking yesterday about how to parse flags, so to keep moving forward, but it's very much a work in progress yet, so nothing to show.
Thanks. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
All right.
Cool. Anyway, David, did I get it sounds like we're in general agreement about the moving towards sub-resources and away from custom logic in the client.
Yes.
So for 110 planning, I can put together a doc capturing kind of the items listed here, and then send it out to SIG CLI mailing list, and then folks who weren't able to add add what they're working on during this meeting can also update that doc, and then we can figure out how we're going to how we're going to track all those work items for the release in 110. And please make sure that you have the KEP where appropriate, that's Kubernetes enhancement proposal, to track the work items or an issue or figure out what the right scope of tracking that is. Is there any, there were some topics added. Did we get through all of them? I know we briefly touched on the Cobra. Was that resolved?
Yep.
And
That's
then, Clayton, is there anything else on server-side printing that you wanted to talk about?
No, we covered it at the beginning right before you joined. So I just said I was going to summarize, write up the work items, and try to send it out the next day or two, so that folks know. I kind of gave an overview of the discussions that have been going on.
Fantastic. Thank you for doing that. Plugins, I think, I know that, I think Chris was working on these. Does anyone here have state on the work that is planned for 110? Okay, I'll follow up on that and then fill in the doc.
Real quick, so with regards to plugins, although I have basically I have no overview of this plan for 110, there was the idea mentioned that we should provide a standard library to make it easier for authors of plugins to essentially perform basic actions that are required across any plugin, such as handling global flags, reading a config file to create a REST client, and all of that. So I have been looking into creating just a generic library for plugins that authors can use.
That's so important. Thank you for bringing that up. I've observed like forking already happening of our infrastructure, and if we can write it once or maybe twice, once like in a place that's published and once in our internal representation, then that's way better than everyone having to reinvent it a slightly different way.
I actually have an open PR against the kubectl repo for exactly that.
To do which piece?
Starting up, finding the config, parsing it, and turning it into the struct representation so it can be consumed.
Okay. Do you have the reviewers need on that, or is it languishing?
No, I've been talking to Skill about it. We're going back and forth.
Perfect. I know Antoine's intent that his stuff can be used also by plugin authors. One thing I think would be helpful to write up for folks, and I'm hoping maybe to give a KubeCon talk on this, we'll see, is the different ways you can write tools. And one way is you can use like the compiled in types and write logic for very specific APIs. And this works great in a controller world, right, where you have some control over the skew between the APIs that the API server knows about, the code version and the controller code version, so that they're at kind of using the same client Go version, for instance. And you're targeting a very specific API, right? Like you're writing controller for deployments, you know what you're reading. You're reading deployments, replica sets, and pods. Another way of writing tools is what we have to do in the CLI with kubectl, which is more subtle and needs to be thought about more carefully, which is you're writing tools that can work against types that you might even know about. And when we talk about like maybe folks writing new tools in the ecosystem or plugin developers or these sorts of folks, they are now writing tools that should probably work against extension APIs that they know about. And the extension API folks who are writing those extensions also don't know about this tool, right? In the common world we see today, at least extension API folks know about kubectl, so they can kind of like test against it and make sure it works. And folks writing tools tend to know about the APIs they're targeting if they're targeting against the core set, like services and deployments and these sorts of things. But in the place where plugin developers are need to develop tools that work against extensions, neither one can actually test directly against one another to see that they work. And they need to follow patterns to make sure they do, right? And like one of those is the one David had brought up, which is using sub-resources, but that means folks writing plugins need to know, like, here's the pattern for talking to sub-resources instead of directly invoking scale on such and such resource. As well as working with unstructured objects and maybe inspecting object schema. Depending on what you're doing, you need to be working with objects based on either properties about those objects or on the methods they expose through, like sub-resources, for instance. And so any libraries we can publish that help in this area, because it's actually something challenging to do, I think would really help folks. Is that familiar? Has anyone else been thinking about things that way, or does that resonate with anyone?
This is Carolyn. Sorry, I've never been here before. Hi, Carolyn Van Slyke from Microsoft. I've been working with Jonathan on the service catalog plugin and standalone binary. I'm a little confused by what you said. Like, is that something that would be targeted towards something like what we've been doing with service catalog, where we're making very specific commands that only work with service catalog, or is this a different type of plugin that you're thinking that would need that unstructured access to the results from API calls?
No, I mean the work you're doing is more of similar to the controller targeted focus, where there's a specific API you want to make changes on, and you're not like, I think one thing you need to do is like refresh broker list or something. Mm-hmm. And so you're probably not trying to create a generalized notion of like relisting of things, like resync for like all sorts of different objects. You're really just focused on relisting brokers for your API. And so in that case, using the compiled-in client, not the generic unstructured stuff, but the compiled-in client, I think targets what you need. You do have another thing you need to be careful about, which is when you when the client and server are version skewed, the serialization, when done through Go structs, drops fields. And so you can't do a naive read, update, write, because when you round trip the object, deserializing it and then serializing it, it will potentially lose information. So we need to also develop more guides and possibly tools. We have some tooling around that already to help, and there's essentially two techniques for dealing with it. The first is that you do not use the naive serialization technique and work against a JSON map or something. Another, I think Protos will soon support this, but you work against a representation of the object that doesn't drop information. And the other is that you do a diff on the object you update against the original one you write in, and now your diff is only comparing things that you know about, so you're not dropping stuff. And then from that diff, you either patch the object using the patch API or locally update, like merge those changes into a JSON map and push that.
Oh, okay. Thanks. We're not doing that right now, so it's good to know.
Yeah, just one thing to be aware of is version skew between client and server is really challenging, and if you want to support that, you got to test it. Probably worth having a separate conversation and maybe even a talk about this.
Okay, thanks.
All right. One other thing is I've been looking at on-call tools, like open source on-call tools, and I'm going to try and get an on-call calendar set up. And I thought what this would allow us to do is, as a community, collectively take on or agree upon who's like responsible for certain activities. One thing of note is like our test grid. We have a lot of tests that are not part of the submit queue blocking suite, and yet we still consider them important for determining the health of our code for release. And so it's very easy for us to get into a state where those tests are failing, and if no one looks at them, we go and like release the code anyway because no one else is looking at them for us. And so we probably want to set up some sort of more formalized responsibility around ensuring those don't just get broken and we ignore them. So I thought just an on-call rotation might be a simple way of trying to solve this. And so once I have that tooling set up, then I can come back and we can kind of talk about what we might want that to look like, and if anyone has any objections or opinions on it.
It's a tough crowd today.
Dude, I need to start bringing better material.
You need to like wave in the air.
There's not much of a carrot there. I mean,
this is why I showed up 15 minutes late. I was like, oh, I can't face these guys. Oh, just kidding. More carrots. Yeah, the carrots are talking about for joining an on-call rotation and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm not that there always has to be one, but yeah, I guess I would generally find that participation for these sorts of things is encouraged by a carrot of some kind.
Yeah, we need to start coming out with carrots. That's true. I think some carrots we do have is the ownership of the project itself and maintainership. Like, I don't think we have we don't really recognize people right now for like people are doing this anyway. People do go in and have to do this sprint work, but we don't really have a structured way of recognizing them or making sure that they don't have to do it all the time in an ad hoc manner, but maybe limiting how often you end up looking at the test grid to 1 week a quarter or something might be a carrot. But yeah, good point. We need to figure that out. I don't know, chocolate. Cool. Well, we're right about at time. Is there anything that anyone wanted to discuss before we end the meeting? Okay, great. So please, if you haven't, make sure you're on the SIG CLI mailing list and that it isn't blocked by your spam filters. I know it's easy to block discussion forums and mailing lists and that sort of thing. But I'm planning on sending out a doc that formalizes the points here about our 110 goals. And then hopefully anyone who owns them can fill in the details if they're missing and where the specific work for those items is being tracked. Fantastic, everyone. Have a good the rest of the week.
Bye-bye.